The night my father celebrated his 70th birthday, he raised his glass high and didn't even bother to look in my direction. "She deserves absolutely nothing," he declared, his voice flat and dismissive. "A total nobody. She never even bothered to build a career." The banquet room erupted in laughter. He turned his back on me and faced my brother instead, announcing his birthday gift, a $1 million villa. Applause followed immediately. My mother nodded along in quiet approval. My sister-in-law clapped harder than anyone else in the room. No one spoke my name. Daniel leaned toward me, his voice a calculated mix of pity and condescension. "Don't look so crushed, Clara. Father is right about the business, but I've already talked to him. Once I take over the estate, I'll find a small place for you in the company, maybe a desk in the back. We won't let you starve even if you are a disappointment." He patted my shoulder, the kind of pat one gives a stray dog, before turning back to toast his $1 million villa. I stayed silent. I waited for my moment to leave. The banquet hall was designed to impress: crystal chandeliers, starched white tablecloths, and servers in black vests moving like shadows between the guests. I had arrived early as instructed. I wasn't there as a guest of honor, but as someone expected to help coordinate, be useful, be invisible. My mother had called 3 days earlier to remind me to check on the caterers and the flowers. She never asked if I wanted to come. She simply assumed I would. I always did. The guest list was filled with my father's business associates, golf club friends, neighbors from their gated community, and relatives I only saw at funerals and milestone birthdays. Most of them didn't know me. As I moved through the room before the speeches began, I caught fragments of conversation. "Richard's daughter, the younger one. I thought she lived out of state. Does she even work? I've never heard anyone mention what she does." I did not correct them. I did not introduce myself. I had learned long ago that my presence at family gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed. My role was to fill empty space, to round out the family portrait for the photographers, and to disappear the moment the camera stopped clicking. My brother Daniel stood near the front of the room with his wife Christine. They looked as though they had been styled for a magazine cover. Daniel wore a tailored navy suit with an impeccable cut. Christine's dress had that understated elegance that whispered quiet money. Together they received congratulations, handshakes, and warm embraces from nearly everyone who entered. No one approached me with that same enthusiasm. A few people offered polite nods. One woman asked if I knew where the restrooms were. Another mistook me for an event coordinator and asked about the dessert options. When my father finally made his announcement about the villa, I was standing near the back wall, close enough to hear every word, far enough to remain unseen. He had waited until most guests had finished their main course, until the champagne had flowed long enough to loosen tongues and heighten emotions. He stood at the head table with my mother at his side, both of them beaming with the satisfaction of people who believed they had earned everything they possessed. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," my father began. 70 years, I never thought I'd make it this far, but here I am surrounded by the people who matter most." He paused for effect, and the room went quiet. "I've been blessed with a wonderful wife, a successful son, and a beautiful daughter-in-law who has given us 2 perfect grandchildren. Our family isn't perfect, but we've built something I'm proud of. And tonight I want to announce something truly special, a gift that represents everything our family stands for. Daniel, Christine, please come up here." My brother and his wife walked to the front, their smiles polished and practiced. My father reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "This is the key to your new home, a villa in Scottsdale, 4 bedrooms, a pool, a view of the mountains. You've earned it, son, for everything you've done for this family, for the business, for our name. This is my way of saying thank you." The applause was immediate and sustained. Christine covered her mouth with her hand, performing surprise, as though she had not known about the gift for weeks. Daniel embraced our father with the kind of warmth that cameras loved, while my mother wiped a stray tear from her eye. I stood frozen, watching the celebration unfold, waiting for someone to turn around and acknowledge that I was still in the room. No one did. It was during the applause that someone asked my father a question I could not quite hear. His response, however, carried across the room with perfect clarity. "Clara," he said, "she deserves nothing. A nobody. She never built a career. Unlike Daniel, she never understood what it takes to succeed in this family." More laughter followed. A few sympathetic glances were sent my way, only to be quickly averted. My mother did not flinch. Christine clapped even louder, as if to emphasize the point. As I reached the door, it opened. A man I did not recognize stepped inside. He was not family. He had not been invited. He was older, perhaps, in his early 60s, with silver hair and a dark suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being in rooms full of powerful people. He scanned the crowd once, then looked directly at me. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but clear. "Are you Clara Whitmore?" The laughter died away instantly. "I'm Thomas Harrington," he continued. "I'm a senior editor with Forbes. I apologize for interrupting your family's celebration, but I need to speak with you. Urgently." The conversations around us faltered. People turned to stare. My father, still standing at the front of the room, with the villa keys in his hand, stared at the stranger with an expression I had never seen on him before. Fear. The applause for Daniel's villa had barely faded when the whispers began. I could feel them moving through the room like ripples across still water, small disturbances that grew larger the further they traveled from their source. The Forbes editor's arrival had disrupted the carefully orchestrated celebration, and now every guest seemed to be recalculating the evening's social mathematics. I did not move from my spot by the back wall. Thomas Harrington had excused himself briefly to take a phone call, promising to return in a few minutes with important information. His departure left me standing alone in a room full of people who had spent the last 3 hours ignoring me completely. My father had returned to his seat at the head table, but his posture had changed. The confident patriarch, who had just been distributing million-dollar gifts, now sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes repeatedly darting toward the door where Harrington had exited. My mother leaned close to whisper something in his ear. He shook his head sharply, a gesture that silenced her immediately. Daniel and Christine remained near the front, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. But I noticed that my brother's smile had grown rigid, his eyes tracking the same door our father watched. Christine kept touching his arm, a gesture that looked supportive, but seemed designed to hold him in place. The celebration continued around me, but something fundamental had shifted. The arrival of a Forbes editor asking specifically for the daughter who had just been publicly dismissed created a narrative inconsistency that no one in the room could resolve. I watched as guests glanced in my direction, then looked away, then looked back again, as if trying to determine whether I had suddenly become someone worth knowing. My earliest memories of Daniel revolved around comparison. He was 4 years older, which meant he reached every milestone first. He walked first, talked first, went to school, first graduated first. By the time I arrived at each achievement, the celebration had already happened. My parents had already documented Daniel's first steps, his first words, his first day of kindergarten. When I did those same things, the response was polite acknowledgement rather than genuine excitement. The pattern continued through my childhood and adolescence. Daniel played football and made the varsity team as a sophomore. I joined the debate club and won regional competitions, but my trophies gathered dust in my bedroom, while Daniel's were displayed in the living room. Daniel got accepted to our father's alma mater and received a car as a graduation gift. I earned a full academic scholarship to a school across the country and received a handshake. The party continued for another hour after Harrington's initial appearance. I watched my family perform their roles with the precision of actors who had rehearsed the same play for decades. My father held court at his table, dispensing wisdom and accepting tributes. My mother circulated among the guests, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and impressed. Daniel and Christine posed for photographs with their new keys, their smiles never wavering. No one asked me to join any of these rituals. No one checked to see if I was still in the room. At one point, my mother approached me briefly, her expression tight with controlled irritation. "Clara, the caterers need someone to check on the dessert service. Could you handle that? You're not doing anything else?" I nodded and moved toward the kitchen, where the servers were preparing trays of miniature cheesecakes and chocolate mousse. They looked startled when I entered, probably because guests were not supposed to be in the service area. I explained that I was just checking on things, and they relaxed, assuming I was a coordinator rather than a family member. The head caterer, Maria, was efficient and organized. She did not need my help, but I stayed for a few minutes anyway, watching her team work with quiet professionalism. The kitchen was the only place in the building where I did not feel like an intruder. When I returned to the main room, I found my father engaged in conversation with several business associates. They were discussing the villa, praising my father's generosity and Daniel's achievements. One man mentioned real estate values in Scottsdale. Another talked about investment portfolios and generational wealth. I stood close enough to hear, though no one seemed to notice my presence. "You must be proud," one of the men said to my father. "Daniel has really made something of himself." My father nodded, his chest expanding with satisfaction. "He has my work ethic. Same drive, same determination. You can see it in everything he does." "And your daughter?" the man asked, glancing around as if just remembering I existed. "What does she do?" My father's expression flickered briefly before settling into something between dismissal and disappointment. "Clara. She's still figuring things out. Always been more of a dreamer than a doer, if you know what I mean. Some people just don't have what it takes to succeed in the real world." The men nodded sympathetically, as if my failure to meet my father's standards was a tragedy they could all understand. Then the conversation moved on to golf handicaps and stock portfolios, and I was forgotten again. Instead, I walked toward the windows overlooking the parking lot where expensive cars waited to carry their owners back to their expensive lives. The night was clear and cold, the kind of winter evening that made breath visible and stars sharp. My mother found me there a few minutes later. "Clara, why are you standing alone? People will think something is wrong." I did not turn to look at her. "People don't think about me at all." She sighed, a sound weighted with years of accumulated frustration. "Don't start this tonight. Your father's celebration isn't the time for your self-pity." "I'm not feeling sorry for myself. I'm stating a fact. No one in this room cares whether I'm here or not." "That's not true. We invited you, didn't we?" I finally turned to face her. "You invited me to check on the caterers and make sure the flower arrangements looked right. That's not the same as wanting me here." My mother's jaw tightened. "You need to understand something, Clara. Your father and I have limited resources. We can't give everything to everyone equally. Daniel has responsibilities, obligations, a family to support. He needs the villa more than you do." "I didn't ask for a villa." "Then what's the problem?" I did not say any of this. I just looked at her until she grew uncomfortable and excused herself to greet someone more important. The caterers began clearing plates as the evening stretched toward its inevitable conclusion. Guests lingered in small clusters, their conversations growing louder with each passing glass of champagne. I remained near the windows, watching the social dynamics of the room with the detached observation of someone who had long ago accepted her position as an outsider. The story of my father's announcement had already begun its transformation into legend. I overheard fragments as they circulated, each retelling slightly different from the last. In one version, Daniel had earned the villa through years of dedicated service to the business. In another, my father had been planning the gift for months, keeping it a secret until the perfect moment. In every version, the villa was proof that hard work and loyalty were rewarded in our family. No one mentioned what my father had said about me. No one questioned whether his assessment was accurate. A woman I vaguely recognized from my parents' neighborhood approached me as I stood by the windows. She was older, well-dressed, with the kind of preserved elegance that suggested regular visits to expensive dermatologists. Her smile had the quality of someone about to offer sympathy they did not actually feel. "You must be Clara," she said, positioning herself beside me as if we were old friends. "Your father mentioned you in his speech." I nodded, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. "It must be difficult," she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Having a brother like Daniel. He's accomplished so much. Hard to live up to, I imagine." "I'm not trying to live up to him." She laughed, the sound tinkling and artificial. "Of course not, dear. Everyone finds their own path. Some paths are just longer than others." She patted my arm with a condescension that left no room for response, then drifted away to join a conversation with people who actually mattered to her. I watched her go, feeling that familiar sensation of being weighed and found wanting by someone who knew nothing about me. People I did not know approached me to offer variations on the same theme. They acknowledged my existence in ways that reinforced my insignificance. They asked questions designed to confirm assumptions they had already made. What did I do for work? Was I married? Did I have children? Each question came loaded with expectations of failure, and each answer I gave seemed to satisfy their need to categorize me as someone who had not achieved what she should have. I stopped engaging after the third or fourth conversation. I gave short answers or no answers at all. My sister-in-law Christine made her way toward me during a lull in the congratulations. She walked with the careful grace of someone who had learned to move in expensive shoes, her smile fixed in place like a mask she had forgotten how to remove. "Clara," she said, stopping close enough that I could smell her perfume, a heavy floral scent that filled the space between us. "I just wanted to say, don't take what your father said too personally. You know how he gets when he's had a few drinks." He wasn't drunk." Christine's smile flickered but held. "Well, he gets carried away sometimes. The villa was a surprise for us, too. We had no idea he was planning something so generous." I looked at her steadily. "You knew about the villa 3 weeks ago. Daniel mentioned it when you came to pick up the kids from my apartment." Her expression shifted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "That was different. We knew he was considering it. We didn't know he'd announce it tonight." "Does the timing matter?" Christine's composure cracked further. "Look, Clara, I'm trying to be nice here. I know things haven't been easy for you, but that's not our fault. Daniel worked hard for everything he has. Your father recognizes that. Maybe if you'd made different choices." "Different choices?" I repeated. "Yes, career choices, life choices. You can't blame us for the fact that you haven't figured out what you want to do with your life." I did not correct her. I did not offer evidence to the contrary. I simply looked at her until she grew uncomfortable enough to excuse herself and return to her husband's side. I excused myself from the main room and found a quiet corner near the coat check. The attendant, a young woman likely working her way through college, looked up from her phone with professional alertness. "Can I help you find something?" "No," I said. "I just need a minute." She nodded sympathetically, the way people do when they recognize someone trying to hold themselves together. "Rough night." "Something like that." She went back to her phone, giving me the privacy I needed. I stood in the quiet space, breathing slowly, reminding myself that this evening was temporary. When I returned to the main room, I found that the dynamics had shifted again. The Forbes editor, Thomas Harrington, had returned from his phone call. He stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd with the focused attention of someone looking for a specific person. Our eyes met across the room. He began walking toward me, his expression unreadable. The conversations around us continued, but I noticed that people were beginning to watch. The same guests who had spent the evening ignoring me were now tracking the Forbes editor's movement, trying to understand why someone from a major financial publication would have any interest in the family's overlooked daughter. My father noticed too. From his position at the head table, he watched Harrington approach me with an expression that combined suspicion and something I had never seen on his face before, genuine concern. Thomas Harrington reached me just as the string quartet my father had hired began playing a waltz. The music provided convenient cover for our conversation, muffling our words from the curious ears around us. "Miss Whitmore," he said, keeping his voice low, "I apologize again for the intrusion. I know this isn't the ideal setting for what I need to discuss." "What do you need to discuss?" He glanced around the room, noting the attention we were attracting. "Perhaps somewhere more private. This conversation shouldn't happen in the middle of your father's celebration." "This isn't my celebration." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding that suggested he had already formed opinions about my family dynamics. "Nevertheless, is there somewhere we could speak without an audience?" Before I could answer, my father appeared beside us. He moved with the forced casualness of someone trying to assert control over a situation he did not understand. "Everything all right here?" he asked, directing the question at Harrington rather than me. "I don't believe we've met. Richard Whitmore." Harrington shook his hand with professional courtesy. "Thomas Harrington, Forbes." My father's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Forbes, I wasn't aware anyone from the press had been invited tonight. I wasn't invited, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here on business. Business? What kind of business would bring Forbes to my birthday party? Harrington looked at me, then back at my father. Business with your daughter, actually. The statement hung in the air between us. My father's confusion was visible, his eyes narrowing his brow, furrowing his mind, clearly struggling to reconcile the idea of Forbes having business with the daughter he had just publicly dismissed as a nobody. Clara. He laughed, but the sound was hollow. I think there might be some mistake. Clara doesn't have any dealings with Forbes. No mistake, Harrington said evenly. Actually, Mr. Whitmore, I've been chasing a shadow for months. My investigation into the sudden shift in the city's commercial landscape led me here. I need your daughter to confirm a few high-stakes details before our lead story goes to print at midnight. It's a matter that will redefine the name Whitmore forever. My father's face hardened. He did not see a secret billionaire. He saw a liability. What has she done now if she's involved in some legal mess or debt? I won't have it ruining my reputation tonight. Clara, tell this man whatever trouble you've caused and get out. Daniel appeared next, Christine trailing behind him. The golden sun had sensed a threat to the evening's narrative and came to support his father. What's going on? Daniel asked, positioning himself beside our father in a display of family solidarity. This gentleman from Forbes claims he has business with your sister, my father said. I was just explaining that there must be some kind of misunderstanding. Daniel looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for moments when I had done something embarrassing. Clara, what is this about? I don't know yet, I said honestly. Mr. Harrington hasn't told me. Then maybe you should ask him to leave. This is Father's birthday, not some business meeting. Harrington remained unruffled by the family's united front. I understand this is an inconvenient time. I wouldn't be here if the matter weren't urgent. We're publishing a story tomorrow morning, and I need to speak with Miss Whitmore before it goes to print. A story about what? My mother demanded. As I said, that's confidential until Miss Whitmore and I have a chance to discuss it. The impasse stretched for several seconds. Guests nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. The string quartet played on their waltz, providing an absurd soundtrack to the growing tension. I made a decision. There's a small conference room down the hall, I said. We can talk there. My father grabbed my arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make his objection clear. Clara, you don't have to do this. We don't know who this man really is or what he wants. He's shown me his credentials, I said, gently removing my arm from his grip. And whatever he has to say, I'd rather hear it in private than in front of all your guests. We should come with you. No. The word surprised him. I could count on one hand the number of times I had directly refused my father anything. He was so accustomed to my compliance that my refusal seemed to stun him into momentary silence. I used that silence to walk away, Harrington falling into step beside me. Thank you, he said quietly as we moved through the crowd. This will be easier to discuss without an audience. I did not respond. I was too aware of the eyes following us, the whispers beginning to spread, the social calculus being recalculated by everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The conference room was small and utilitarian, clearly a space meant for building management rather than elegant gatherings. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the furniture consisted of a scratched table surrounded by mismatched chairs. It was a stark contrast to the chandelier-lit ballroom we had just left. Harrington closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. I remained standing. Say what you came to say. He nodded, reaching into his jacket pocket for a leather portfolio. Miss Whitmore, I'll get straight to the point. Forbes has been working on a feature about anonymous investors who have quietly amassed significant real estate portfolios over the past decade. Our research led us to a holding company called Whitfield Properties. Are you familiar with it? I said nothing. I understand if you're reluctant to confirm. Many of our subjects prefer anonymity, but the story is going to be published tomorrow morning regardless. I'm here tonight because we wanted to give you the opportunity to comment before it does. Why tonight? I finally asked. Why not reach out through normal channels? We tried. Your representatives have been declining our requests for weeks. When we learned about your father's birthday celebration, we decided to make a final attempt. Tomorrow's issue goes to print at midnight. What do you want from me? Just confirmation. And if you're willing, a brief comment for the article. I turned to face him. And if I refuse to confirm, we'll publish based on our documentation. We have corporate records, property deeds, financial statements. He spread several documents on the table. Records I recognized a paper trail that led unmistakably to me. Miss Whitmore, I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've profiled billionaires and titans of industry, but I've never seen anyone build what you've built while remaining so completely invisible. I looked at the documents at the proof of everything I had created while my family was busy dismissing me. No, I said quietly. They don't see. But for the first time that night, the room was not laughing anymore. Harrington gave me 15 minutes to make my decision. He stepped into the hallway to make a phone call, leaving me alone with the documents spread across the conference table. I heard footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets moving with purpose. A moment later, my father opened the conference room door without knocking. My mother and Daniel were close behind, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed alarm. "Clara, what is going on?" my father demanded. "That man won't tell us anything. What does Forbes want with you? He came to verify some information for an article they're publishing tomorrow." "What article? What information? About my work?" My father laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Your work? What work?" "Clara, I don't know what you've told these people, but you need to explain to them that there's been a mistake. You don't have anything Forbes would want to write about." "Richard," my mother said quietly, her tone carrying a warning. "No, this is absurd. Clara doesn't have a career. She doesn't have accomplishments. She's been drifting for years while Daniel built something real. Whatever this is, it's obviously some kind of misunderstanding, and we need to clear it up before it causes problems for the family." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Father's right. Clara, whatever you've gotten yourself into, we can fix it. But you need to tell us what's happening." I sat down at the conference table, suddenly very tired. "I haven't gotten myself into anything," I said, "and there's nothing to fix." "Then why is Forbes here?" Before I could answer, Harrington returned. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. My father's aggressive posture, my mother's worried hands, Daniel's protective stance, and me sitting calmly at the table while my family surrounded me like prosecutors around a defendant. "I see we have company," Harrington said mildly. "This is a family matter," my father said. "Whatever you think you know about my daughter, I can assure you, Mr. Whitmore." Harrington interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "With respect, I've done extensive research. I know exactly who your daughter is. She's nobody. She has nothing. I've been supporting her for years while she figured out her life. Have you?" The question hung in the air. My father's confidence wavered for the first time. "She lived in modest apartments. She's driven used cars. She's never shown any signs of financial success whatsoever." "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Whitmore." "What's that supposed to mean?" Harrington looked at me silently, asking permission. I gave a small nod. "It means that while you've been supporting your son with million-dollar villas, your daughter has been quietly building a real estate portfolio worth more than most Fortune 500 executives will accumulate in their lifetimes. Your daughter is the sole beneficial owner of Whitfield Properties, a holding company with assets valued at approximately $1.2 billion. My father's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. My mother went very still. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between disbelief and the first flickerings of genuine fear. "That's impossible," my father finally managed. "I have the documentation right here." Harrington gestured at the papers on the table. "Corporate records, property deeds, financial statements. Your daughter is the sole owner." My father reached for the nearest document with hands that were not quite steady. He scanned the page, his eyes moving rapidly across numbers and names he did not recognize. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. Not disappointment, not dismissal, not condescension. "Clara, how—" I did not answer. "I need to speak with Mr. Harrington privately, I said. Please leave. We're not leaving until we understand what's happening, Daniel said. Daniel, you haven't been interested in what's happening in my life for 15 years. You don't get to start now because Forbes showed up. The words landed harder than I intended. Daniel stepped back as if I had struck him. My mother moved to my father's side, steadying him with a hand on his arm. Richard, perhaps we should give Clara some space. We can discuss this after— No. My father's voice had regained some of its authority, though it sounded hollow. I want to know how this happened. I want to know why no one told me. Because you never asked, I said quietly. Because you decided who I was when I was 12 years old, and you never revised that opinion no matter what I did. Because every time I tried to tell you about my life, you compared me to Daniel and found me lacking. Because you just stood up in front of 100 people and called me a nobody. Harrington cleared his throat. Miss Whitmore, I need your decision about the article. We're running short on time. I looked at my family, at the people who had spent decades treating me as an afterthought, a disappointment, a cautionary tale to be shared at dinner parties. Then I looked at Harrington, at the documents that proved everything I had built at the future that was about to unfold, whether I approved or not. Publish the story, I said. I'll give you your comment. No one was celebrating anymore. They were waiting. Thomas Harrington pulled out a small recorder and placed it on the conference table. My family remained frozen in their positions, my father gripping the back of a chair, my mother pressed against his side, Daniel standing near the door with Christine, who had joined us at some point during the conversation. The silver casing of the recorder caught the harsh fluorescent light as it sat motionless between us. Harrington's hand hovered over the device for a moment, his fingers steady while the hum of the building's ventilation system became the only audible sound in the room. No one moved to sit. No one reached for the water pitcher in the center of the table. Harrington nodded, satisfied. Do you have any comments you'd like included in the article? No comment, I said. The documents speak for themselves. Harrington closed his portfolio with a sharp click that echoed off the bare walls. He moved with deliberate slowness as he retrieved his recorder, his gaze sweeping over the family members who had yet to change their postures. He adjusted his jacket, the fabric rustling in the absolute quiet, before he looked back at me. Harrington stood. Thank you for your time, Miss Whitmore, and congratulations on your achievements. He left the conference room, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed felt different from the silence before, heavier, more permanent. My father was staring at the spot where Harrington had been standing, his expression empty. My mother had tears running down her face, though, whether from shock or some other emotion I could not tell. Daniel looked at me like I was a stranger he had never met. The ticking of a clock on the far wall seemed to grow louder with every second that passed. My father's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths, but he remained anchored to his chair. My mother reached up to touch her necklace, her fingers trembling against the metal, but she did not speak or turn toward him. Christine was the first to speak. How long have you been hiding this? I did not answer immediately, letting the question hang in the air until it felt brittle. I turned to look at her, my posture unyielding, as she took a small step back toward the door. The distance between us seemed to expand, even though no one had actually moved. I haven't been hiding anything. I've been living my life. You just weren't paying attention. You let us think you were struggling. You let us believe you needed help. I never asked you for help. You assumed I needed it because that's what you wanted to believe. My father finally found his voice. Clara, this doesn't make sense. You're saying you built a billion-dollar business without anyone knowing, without any support. How is that possible? The same way anyone builds anything, one decision at a time. But the money, where did the money come from? I never gave you anything beyond what was necessary. I know. The room went still again. My father's hand dropped from the back of the chair, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the tabletop. Daniel took a half step forward, then stopped, his arms hanging limp at his sides. My father flinched. Daniel stepped forward. Clara, we didn't know. How could we have known? You never told us. When exactly should I have told you? At the Thanksgiving dinner where Father compared my apartment to your vacation home? At the Christmas party where Mother told everyone I was still finding myself at 32. At every family gathering where you talked about your promotions and your bonuses, while no one asked me a single question about my life. I stood up from the table. I stopped telling you things because you stopped listening, years ago. The person you've been dismissing at every holiday, every birthday, every casual conversation, that person doesn't exist. She never did. You invented her because it was easier than seeing me as I actually am. My mother reached toward me. Clara, honey, we didn't mean, don't. I stepped back from her hand. Don't tell me what you meant. I know what you meant. You meant every word you said tonight. Father stood up in front of 100 people and called me a nobody who never built a career. That wasn't a mistake. That was what he believed. My father's face had gone pale. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Tomorrow morning, everyone at this party will learn what Forbes learned. They'll read about the daughter Richard Whitmore dismissed as worthless, and they'll see the numbers. They'll make their own assessments. I won't be explaining anything for you. Whatever you tell them is your business, but I'm done being invisible in this family. I'm done. I walked out without waiting for a response. No one had asked her a single question all night. Now, no one dared to speak at all. I returned to the main ballroom to find the celebration continuing in diminished form. Half the guests had already left, likely sensing that the evening had soured without understanding why. The remaining attendees clustered in small groups, their conversations more subdued than before. The string quartet had switched to slower pieces, their music filling silence, rather than inspiring dancing. I walked through the room without stopping to speak to anyone. I did not need to. The atmosphere had already shifted in ways that could not be reversed. I passed a group of business associates near the center of the hall. As I approached, their conversation clipped off abruptly. One man turned his back to examine a floral arrangement, while another suddenly became very interested in the bottom of his empty champagne glass. They did not look up as I moved past them. My family emerged from the hallway a few minutes after me. I watched from across the room as they attempted to rejoin the party, their faces arranged in expressions of normalcy that could not quite mask the shock underneath. My father made his way to a group of business associates near the bar. His voice was loud enough to carry when he laughed at something one of them said, but the laugh sounded forced. The men around him seemed to notice their responses were polite but measured, lacking the warmth that had characterized their earlier interactions. They stood in a loose circle, the spacing wider than it had been earlier in the night. When my father spoke, the men nodded, but their eyes drifted toward the exit or the musicians. No one asked him a follow-up question. Daniel and Christine positioned themselves near the gift table, where they made a show of examining the cards and presents that had accumulated throughout the evening. Christine smiled at everyone who passed, but her eyes kept darting toward me, then away, as if she could not decide whether looking at me was dangerous. She picked up a small gift box, turning it over in her hands repeatedly without looking at the tag. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the double doors at the far end of the room. When a waiter offered them a tray of appetizers, they both declined without looking at the man. My mother stayed close to my father, her hand on his arm, her role as supportive wife apparently the only thing she knew how to perform in moments of uncertainty. She nodded along to conversations without contributing, smiled at people without warmth, and moved through the room like someone walking through a dream that had become a nightmare. I noticed that the guests who remained were behaving differently now. They still ignored me for the most part, but the quality of their ignoring had changed. Before, they had looked past me, as if I genuinely did not exist. Now they were actively avoiding eye contact, deliberately turning away when I moved in their direction, carefully positioning themselves so that engaging with me would not be necessary. A neighbor of my parents, a woman who had spoken to me earlier in the night, stepped behind a pillar as I walked toward the buffet table. Two men standing near the windows broke their huddle and moved in opposite directions as soon as I turned toward them. The murmurs in the room were low, a steady hum that stopped and started in patches depending on where I was standing. I found a seat near the windows and watched the careful dance unfold. A woman who had earlier asked me about the dessert options passed by without acknowledgement. A man who had laughed at my father's nobody comment studiously examined his phone whenever I was in his line of sight. The head caterer, Maria, caught my eye briefly and gave me a small nod that might have been sympathy or solidarity. Maria's team continued to move through the room, clearing half-empty glasses with efficient, quiet motions. They were the only people who did not change their path as I sat there. The guests around me maintained a strict 5-foot radius of empty space, their heads tilted toward each other in urgent, whispered exchanges. My father attempted to restore normalcy by giving an impromptu toast. He stood near the bar and raised his glass, his voice carrying across the room with forced confidence. "I want to thank everyone again for being here tonight. This has been an evening I'll never forget. To my family, though," he continued, "to loyalty, to the bonds that hold us together through everything." A few guests raised their glasses. Most did not. The toast felt hollow, the words contradicting everything that had happened in the past hour. When he finished, the conversations resumed, but they had a different character now. I overheard fragments as they drifted past me. "What do you think that Forbes thing was about?" "No idea. Something about the daughter, apparently." "Didn't he just say she was a nobody? Strange, right? Why would Forbes care about someone who's a nobody?" The questions hung in the air unanswered. My family could not explain without revealing what they had learned, and they clearly were not ready to reveal anything. Daniel approached me as the evening wound toward its conclusion. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Clara, can we talk?" "We are talking. I mean really talk, about what happened there." "I don't have anything else to say." "Well, I do." He took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "I don't understand how you did this, how you built something this big without any of us knowing. It doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense. You just weren't paying attention." "That's not fair." "Isn't it? When's the last time you asked me about my work? When's the last time you showed any interest in what I was doing with my life?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. "Exactly," I said. "You didn't ask because you didn't care, because in your mind I was already defined. I was the unsuccessful sibling who made you look better by comparison. You needed me to be that, so you never looked closely enough to see anything else." Father was wrong to say what he said. I can see that now. You couldn't see it an hour ago. You clapped along with everyone else. He had no response to that. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'll have my assistant contact the family in the morning to coordinate any necessary follow-up regarding the article. You have an assistant. I have a staff, a company, a life you've never asked about." I picked up my purse from the chair. "Tomorrow everyone who is at this party will learn the truth. What you do with that information is your business, but don't expect me to help clean up the mess." I walked away without looking back. Nothing had exploded, but the room would never arrange itself around them again. The Forbes article published at 6 a.m. Eastern, exactly as Thomas Harrington had promised. By 7, my phone had accumulated over 300 messages from numbers I did not recognize. By 8, the major business news networks had picked up the story. By noon, my father's birthday celebration had become a footnote to the larger narrative of a secret billionaire revealed. I watched the coverage from the living room of my apartment, the same modest 2-bedroom unit I had occupied for the past 8 years. The same space my family had used as evidence of my failure. The same address they visited once a year to pick up their grandchildren's birthday presents, always with comments about how I should really think about moving somewhere nicer. The news coverage focused primarily on the scale of my holdings and the apparent disconnect between my public persona and my actual worth. My phone rang around 1 p.m. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was brief. "Clara, we need to talk. Please call me back." I did not call back. The second message an hour later was longer. "Clara, people are calling. Friends, neighbors. They want to know if it's true. Father doesn't know what to tell them. Please just talk to us." I did not call back. The third message 3 hours after that was my father's voice. "Clara, this is ridiculous. You can't just drop something like this and then disappear. We're your family. We deserve an explanation. Call me." I turned off my phone. The evening news programs ran segments analyzing the Whitmore revelation, as some outlets were calling it. They showed my father's photograph next to mine and noted the irony of his birthday celebration becoming the setting for his daughter's unmasking. One commentator pointed out that Richard Whitmore's own net worth was estimated at around $30 million, a respectable sum, but less than 3% of what his daughter had quietly accumulated. I watched my father's world shrink in real time. The calls from business associates that usually came on Sunday mornings stopped coming. The invitations to golf outings and dinner parties that had been regular features of his social calendar failed to materialize. The people who had laughed at his birthday toast were suddenly unavailable, their responses polite but distant when my father's name came up. Monday morning brought another round of coverage, this time focusing on the properties themselves. Real estate journalists traced the history of my acquisitions, mapping the steady expansion from that first duplex to the current portfolio. They interviewed tenants in my apartment buildings, managers at my commercial properties, contractors who had worked on my developments. The picture that emerged was of a careful, methodical investor who treated employees well, maintained her properties responsibly, and operated with an integrity that surprised observers expecting the usual billionaire excess. The contrast with my family's public behavior at the birthday party was noted frequently. My brother called on Tuesday. I answered because I was curious what he would say. "Clara." His voice was rough, as if he had not slept well. "We need to talk." "Talk. Not on the phone, in person. Can I come over?" "To my apartment. The one you've been using as evidence of my failure for 8 years." Silence on the other end. "That's what I thought," I said. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I want to understand. I want to know how this happened. You want to know how I succeeded while you weren't watching." "That's not," he sighed. "Okay. Yes, that's part of it. I don't understand how you did this without any of us knowing. Because you never asked. Because you never looked. Because you were too busy being the golden son to notice that your sister was building something bigger than your entire career. I'm not trying to compete with you. No, you're trying to understand why you didn't see this coming. Because if I could hide something this big from you, what else did you miss? What else don't you know about your own life?" Another silence. "Father's having a hard time," Daniel finally said. "People are calling to ask about you and he doesn't know what to tell them. He's embarrassed." "He should be." "Clara." He stood up at his birthday party and called me a nobody in front of 100 people. People who are now reading articles about how his nobody daughter is worth 40 times what he is. Of course he's embarrassed. He should have been embarrassed before the Forbes article, but apparently that wasn't enough reason. He didn't know. That's exactly the problem. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Nothing had been taken from them directly, but everything that mattered had quietly moved on. The week following the Forbes revelation was a study in silence, not the hostile silence of active rejection, but the passive silence of gradual erasure. My family discovered that their social standing had been built on assumptions that no longer held. I learned about their experience secondhand through mutual acquaintances who had suddenly become eager to share information with me. The same people who had ignored me at my father's party now found reasons to reach out, offering congratulations and asking subtle questions about the family dynamics they had witnessed. I answered none of them, but I listened to what they had to say. My father's golf foursome had rescheduled indefinitely. The reason given was conflicting travel plans, but one of the members had told another acquaintance that they felt uncomfortable playing with Richard after what had happened. They did not know how to act around him anymore. The easy camaraderie of men who considered themselves equals had been disrupted by the revelation that Richard's own assessment of his children had been catastrophically wrong. My mother's book club had met without her. She had been told that the discussion would focus on a novel she had not read, but the real reason was simpler. The other women did not want to discuss the Forbes article in front of her, and they could not meet without discussing it. Daniel's position at the family business, a manufacturing company my father had built over 4 decades, had become awkward. Employees who had previously deferred to him as the heir apparent now looked at him with something like pity. Christine had stopped attending her usual social events. The women in her circle had been texting each other about the Whitmore situation since the story broke, and Christine's presence would have required either ignoring the elephant in the room or discussing it directly. Neither option was appealing. The family's isolation was not complete, of course. They still had their core relationships, their genuine friendships, and their business obligations that required continued interaction. But the broader social network they had cultivated over decades, the dinner party invitations, the charity board positions, the golf outings and club memberships that signified belonging, had contracted noticeably. People were polite, people were correct, people were carefully neutral in ways that communicated more than hostility ever could. My family was experiencing consequences I had not planned and did not particularly want. Their social status was eroding, not because I had attacked it, but because the foundation it rested on, my father's authority, my brother's achievements, the family's collective success, had been revealed as less impressive than everyone had assumed. On Thursday, my father's assistant called my office line. She explained that Mr. Whitmore wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss family matters of mutual importance. She used the formal language of professional communication as if my father were a business associate rather than my parent. I declined the meeting. I did so politely through my own assistant using the same formal language. We had nothing to discuss. Any necessary communication could be handled through appropriate channels. On Friday, my brother showed up at my building. He had apparently learned the address from the Forbes article and decided that showing up in person would be more effective than another phone call. I said no. They escorted him out with professional courtesy. On Saturday, my mother appeared at the modest apartment, the one she thought was my real home. I happened to be there collecting mail that had accumulated since the article was published. I saw her car pull into the lot through the window and had time to decide whether to answer the door. I decided to answer. She looked older than she had at the birthday party, though only a week had passed. The careful makeup and styled hair remained, but something in her posture had changed. She held herself differently, as if she was not sure she deserved to take up space. "Can I come in?" she asked, "for a few minutes." She entered the apartment looking around as if seeing it for the first time. In a sense, she was. The space that had seemed to her like evidence of struggle now looked like a deliberate choice, a conscious embrace of simplicity by someone who could afford anything. "Clara, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything. Your father is devastated. His pride is damaged. That's not the same thing." She sat down on the edge of the sofa, perching rather than settling. "He never meant for things to be this way." "What way?" "This distance between you. He always hoped you'd find your path eventually." "I found my path 20 years ago. He just wasn't looking." "He was wrong. I know that now. We were both wrong." I sat across from her, maintaining distance. "What do you want?" "I want to understand. I want to know why you never told us." "Because you never asked. Because every time I tried to share something, you changed the subject back to Daniel. Because the story you wanted to tell about your family didn't include a successful daughter, so you stopped seeing me as one." "That's not true." "It is true. You made me an example of what happens when someone doesn't follow father's advice. You used me to make Daniel look better. You needed me to be a failure." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't need you to be anything. We just wanted you to be happy." "No, you wanted me to be happy in a way you could understand. When I chose a different path, you decided I must be lost rather than simply going somewhere you couldn't follow." The tears spilled over. My mother wiped them away with a practiced gesture, maintaining her composure even as it cracked. "Can we fix this?" she asked. "Is there any way to start over?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but today isn't the day to try." She nodded, accepting the answer without argument. When she left a few minutes later, she did not try to hug me. She did not ask when we could talk again. She just walked to her car and drove away. Nothing had been taken from them directly. But everything that mattered had quietly moved on. The family meeting happened 2 weeks after the Forbes article. My father called it using language that suggested command rather than request. Daniel reported this to me in a voicemail. I did not return. Apparently I had been invited, though the invitation was delivered through my brother rather than directly. I did not attend, but I learned what happened from sources that had emerged since my unmasking. The meeting took place at my parents' house in the formal living room my mother reserved for occasions she considered significant. My father sat in his usual chair, the leather wingback positioned near the fireplace, where he could address the room like a CEO addressing his board. My mother sat on the adjacent sofa. Daniel and Christine occupied matching chairs on the opposite side. My father opened with a speech. He spoke about family loyalty, about discretion, about the importance of presenting a united front to the outside world. He spoke about the media attention and how it needed to be managed carefully. He spoke about Clara, about me, as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person who had made choices. The speech lasted approximately 10 minutes. When it ended, Daniel asked the first question. "What are we supposed to tell people?" My father did not have an answer. The usual authority in his voice faltered when he tried to respond. He had not prepared for questions. He had expected everyone to accept his analysis and follow his lead the way they always had. My mother intervened with a suggestion. Perhaps they could frame the situation as a happy surprise. Perhaps they could claim they had known about Clara's success all along and had been respecting her privacy. Perhaps the public humiliation at the birthday party could be explained away as a joke gone wrong. Christine rejected this immediately. Too many people had been at the party. Too many had heard exactly what my father had said. Any attempt to rewrite history would be exposed as a lie, making the family look worse rather than better. The discussion devolved from there. The argument was cut short by a realization more painful than any debt. My father stared at the documents Harrington had left on the table. He was not looking at the total value anymore. He was looking at the dates. I had been a billionaire for 5 years. 5 years of him calling me a failure. 5 years of him offering me pity, while I could have bought his entire world 1,000 times over without blinking. "She didn't need us," my father whispered, his voice breaking. "She sat at our table for 5 years listening to us laugh at her, knowing she owned more of this city than I ever dreamed of. She didn't just hide her money, Daniel. She hid herself from us because we weren't worth knowing." Daniel blamed my father for the public comments that had created the contrast. If my father had simply given his toast without mentioning Clara, without calling her a nobody, the Forbes revelation would have been surprising, but not humiliating. The family could have claimed ignorance without looking foolish. My father blamed Daniel for not knowing about his own sister's success. Daniel was supposed to maintain family connections to keep track of what everyone was doing. How could he have missed something this significant happening right under his nose? Christine blamed both of them for excluding her from the conversation. She had always been suspicious of the family's treatment of Clara, she claimed. She had always thought there was more to the situation than met the eye. If anyone had listened to her concerns, perhaps they would have discovered the truth sooner. My mother blamed everyone for arguing instead of finding solutions. The family's reputation was at stake. They needed to work together, not tear each other apart. But working together required a leader, and my father's leadership had been fundamentally undermined. Now the world knew that his assessment of his own daughter had been catastrophically wrong. Daniel apparently asked this question directly. My father had no response. For the first time in anyone's memory, Richard Whitmore had been confronted with evidence of his own fallibility that he could not dismiss or explain away. The meeting ended without resolution. No strategy was agreed upon. No unified message was crafted. The family members returned to their separate lives with the understanding that each would handle their own situation as best they could. The fractures that had always existed beneath the surface of the Whitmore family were now visible to everyone. The structure my father had built over decades, the hierarchy of success and failure, the clear division between those who mattered and those who did not, had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. For the first time, no one in that room knew who was supposed to lead. The charity gala, 3 weeks after the Forbes article, was exactly the kind of event my family had always attended. black tie dress code. The guest list included the same business leaders, community figures, and social arbiters who had been at my father's birthday celebration, the same people who had witnessed my public humiliation and then learned days later that I was wealthier than all of them combined. My invitation arrived through official channels, a formal request from the gala's organizing committee sent to my corporate offices with appropriate deference. They wanted me to attend. More than that, they wanted me to speak. I accepted. I learned from secondary sources that my family had also expected to attend. The gala was a regular fixture on their social calendar, an opportunity to see and be seen, to reinforce their position in the community's upper echelons. They had purchased their tickets months in advance, back when the Whitmore family was still considered important enough to merit prominent seating. Their tickets were returned. The committee cited limited capacity due to unexpected demand. They offered sincere apologies and promised priority consideration for next year's event. The language was polished and professional, conveying the essential message without saying anything directly. The Whitmores were no longer welcome at the table they had occupied for years. I did not learn about this until the night of the gala itself. I arrived at the venue in a simple black dress, the kind of understated elegance that communicated wealth without ostentation. My security team had coordinated with the event organizers in advance. Everything proceeded smoothly. The reaction to my presence was immediate but subtle. Conversations paused when I entered. Eyes tracked my movement across the room. People who had ignored me for decades suddenly found reasons to position themselves in my path, offering greetings and congratulations that carried the careful warmth of those who wanted to be remembered favorably. I did not seek out attention. I simply moved through the space, accepting handshakes and smiles with neutral graciousness. I saw my family once during the evening. They had arrived at the venue despite having their tickets returned, apparently hoping to negotiate their way inside through personal connections. I spotted them near the entrance, engaged in a tense conversation with one of the event coordinators. My father was speaking with the controlled frustration of someone accustomed to getting his way. My mother stood beside him, her expression frozen in social performance. Daniel hung back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Christine had apparently declined to attend at all. I did not have to say a word to security. In our world, power has its own gravity. The moment my name was printed, my father's status evaporated. The coordinator did not turn them away because I told her to. She turned them away because in the eyes of the elite, a man who could not even recognize a titan under his own roof was a social liability. To associate with him was to admit you were as blind as he was. Our eyes met across the distance. My father, my mother, my brother. All three looked at me with expressions of recognition that came 20 years too late. I did not approach them. I did not wave or nod or offer any gesture of acknowledgement. I simply turned away and continued toward the main ballroom where the evening's program was about to begin. The speech I gave was brief. I talked about affordable housing, the importance of supporting families who were working to build better lives, and the values that had guided my investments over the years. I did not mention my family. I did not reference the Forbes article, the birthday party, or any of the drama that had brought me to this moment. The audience applauded. The nonprofit's director thanked me for years of anonymous support. Photographs were taken. Interviews were declined. When the formal program ended, I slipped out through a side exit, avoiding the crowds who wanted to extend conversations, propose partnerships, or simply bask in proximity to someone the world had suddenly decided was important. My driver was waiting in the designated area. I climbed into the back seat and let the quiet of the vehicle surround me. She had not taken anything from them. She had simply stopped being available. The morning after the gala was quiet. I woke up in my actual residence and watched the sun rise over a city that now knew my name. The coverage of the previous evening's event was already circulating online, my photograph accompanying stories about anonymous philanthropy and the mysterious billionaire who had hidden in plain sight. I made coffee in the kitchen that overlooked the skyline, the same skyline I had watched from the window of my first duplex, calculating how many properties I would need to acquire before I could afford a view like this one. The journey from there to here had taken 20 years, and now it was complete in ways I was still processing. My phone remained off. It had been off since the Forbes article, except for brief periods when I coordinated with my staff about necessary business matters. The messages from my family had accumulated in my voicemail, growing increasingly desperate as the days passed. I had not listened to most of them. I did not need to know what they were saying. The conversation I had been avoiding for decades was not going to happen on their terms. The morning stretched into the afternoon. I read answered emails and reviewed the quarterly reports my CFO had prepared. The business continued operating regardless of the publicity, the properties generating revenue, the investments appreciating the empire I had built, functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Nothing about my actual life had changed because of the Forbes article. Only the world's perception of that life had shifted. Around 3 p.m, I received a message through official channels. My assistant forwarded it without comment, a formal letter from my father printed on his company's letterhead requesting a meeting to discuss family matters of mutual importance. I considered the letter for a long time. The language was careful, stripped of the authority and condescension that had characterized my father's communication for as long as I could remember. He was asking rather than telling, requesting rather than demanding. The shift in tone acknowledged something he had never acknowledged before, that I had the power to refuse him. I considered the letter, then thought about the monthly allowance Daniel had once offered me. I thought about the administrative desk they had planned for their disappointment of a daughter. I did not send a response. I did not have my lawyers call. I simply dropped the letter into the shredder, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of housekeeping. They had spent 30 years making me nothing, and I was finally giving them exactly what they wanted: nothingness. My silence was not a weapon. It was a boundary they would never cross again. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of peaceful. The media attention faded as newer stories captured the public's interest. My family retreated from public view, managing their embarrassment with whatever private resources they could marshal. The social circles that had once welcomed them slowly closed, not with dramatic exclusions, but with the gradual cooling of invitations and opportunities. I heard through intermediaries that my father had scaled back his involvement in the company, citing health concerns that no one quite believed. Daniel had been given more responsibility, but the transition was awkward. The authority he inherited was shadowed by questions about whether he deserved it. My mother had withdrawn from most of her social activities. She spent more time at home now, more time alone. My family had called me nothing for 30 years. They had defined me by my deficiencies, measured me by their own standards, and found me consistently wanting. And now the world knew different, not because I had proven them wrong, but because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. I did not need them to apologize. I did not need them to acknowledge their mistakes. I did not need anything from them at all. The wealth I had built was mine, accumulated through my own choices and efforts. The life I had constructed existed independent of their opinions. They had called me nothing, and I finally understood nothing was something they no longer controlled.